Thank you for joining us. My name's Paul Scuffin. I'm the Director of the Menzies Health Institute, Queensland, here at Griffith University, and I'm a member of the ACTA Research Prioritisation Group and the Impact and Implementation Group. So it's a pleasure to bring you to this work on behalf of ACTA. I'm joined today by Associate Professor Hanson Tafaha, Professor Carmel Hawley, Greg Mullins, and Professor Paul Hanson. We've got a great lineup for the next 90 minutes, but we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today and pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend their respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and to our brothers across the ditch in New Zealand. A bit of housekeeping as we move on. I'm sure you're used to Zoom by now and other platforms, but a few housekeeping rules. Please put yourself on mute and turn off your camera during the presentations, and we encourage you to use the chat function. Please post questions for speakers in that chat box, and we'll collate these questions and read them out at the end. We'll attempt to address as many as we can in the time we have, and I will present these questions to the speakers in the Q&A session at the end of the workshop. And just to flag that this workshop is being recorded. ACTA. So what is ACTA? ACTA was established in 2014 to connect and support three core member groups: the clinical trial networks, the clinical trial coordinating centres, and the clinical quality registries. ACTA is the contact point across the sector as a common voice for these organisations. Within these organisations, there are more than 10,000 clinician researchers, research teams, and consumers that make research happen. So it's a big organisation and it's fantastic. So today our first speaker is Associate Professor Hanson Tafaha, and also my former PhD student, so great privilege in introducing him. Hanson was a Principal Research Fellow at the Centre for Business and Economics for Health at University of Queensland. He leads the health technology assessment team there, and his research involves economic evaluation of healthcare interventions. He pioneers the application of value of information analysis in Australia as a novel approach to inform early reimbursement decisions and to design efficient and adaptive clinical trials that maximise return on investment. He is also a leader of the ACTA Research Prioritisation Reference Group. Hanson will present today on return on investment and value of information analysis. So thank you, Hanson, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. In this presentation, I will give an overview about how to estimate value for money of clinical trials, and I will present a case study of a real-world example demonstrating this calculation. And hopefully at the end, we'll have the opportunity to see how to incorporate value of research into existing research prioritization frameworks. I will start with the why, and we know that health research is essential to inform decision-making and improve health. But we also know that research resources are limited, and we often have to make decisions about the best way to prioritize research studies and allocate our funding budgets. When making these decisions, we need to keep in mind that there is always an opportunity cost when we direct our funding in one way or another. So if we want to fund one study, there is an opportunity cost of not funding another research study. And this is why we need to have an explicit comparison of the expected research benefits and costs, which we refer to as value for money of research. And this is fundamental to achieve efficient utilization of research budgets and to maximize returns on research investments. We do this with any health investment here in Australia. We subject all interventions to this scrutiny of evaluating costs and benefits. And there is an increasing interest now in doing the same thing to our research investment. An example of this is this month, the MRFF is engaging with stakeholders in developing its 5-year strategy, the new strategy for 2021 and 2026. And in one of the sections, there's an important section about the value of research. And in that section, it's explicitly mentioned that there is an opportunity cost when we allocate funding, and there is an increasing demand here or call for considering value for money. And the document refers to some of the frameworks that we will discuss today that will allow us to assess the value for money of individual research proposals. This interest is also demonstrated in the results of the survey that ACTA Research F, a Research Prioritization group, conducted. And we asked consumers, researchers, and funders about their opinion whether or not we should include return on investment in the research prioritization process. And 20 out of 227 respondents, we had 106 consumers, 106 researchers, and 15 funders. And as you can see, more than half of participants supported the use of return on investment in research prioritization. Around 20% were not sure of whether or not we should be including return on investment. And the rest, they did not think that it should be included. We do have approaches actually to assess value for money of health research. And these can be broadly categorized into top-down or macroeconomic approaches and bottom-up microeconomic approaches. In the top-down approach, we look at the economic and health benefits realized over a certain period of time, and we try to attribute a proportion of these benefits to the research conducted during that period or before. And as you can imagine, it is sometimes challenging, if not impossible, to attribute those benefits to individual clinical trials. The microeconomic approach or the bottom-up approach, on the other hand, what it does is we look at the individual clinical studies or research studies and evaluate these, and collectively we can look at the value of research that comes from all these included trials or studies. In terms of when the time that we do this evaluation, could be retrospective, which is often, what we have seen most often in the published literature, where we look at the research that have been completed, and we look at the benefits realized. However, the focus of this presentation and our efforts in this group is to prospectively evaluate value for money, because this will inform research prioritization and decision making. So the question is, how can we assess value for money prospectively then? To answer this question, we need to understand the sources of benefit, or what a clinical trial or research study, how a clinical trial or research study brings benefit. We know that if we have a new clinical trial, this will provide the evidence that we need about efficacy, safety, and cost, and this will inform decision making. So informing decision making is an important element. This new information can be translated into a new policy and or guidelines, and then there will be implementation, and eventually we will see health and economic benefits realized. So this is the second component, which is through the implementation of the results of a research study. Now, the value of a research study can be estimated by comparing two states, a state where we have a research conducted with the current state where we don't have that research or the results from that research available. So the information, the benefit of the new information minus the benefit that we would get based on existing information is the benefit of the new information. And this is what we use to estimate the return on investment of new research. The framework that accommodates for the two elements, the reduction in uncertainty that is improving decision-making and improving implementation, is the value of information analysis. It has been around for almost 25 years now, and it has two elements. It considers the benefits of a new clinical trial in reducing decision uncertainty, because when we make suboptimal decisions or wrong decisions, there is always the opportunity cost of making that wrong decision, and that cost may not be reversed. So by improving our knowledge, we can make better decisions and avoid the costly consequences of wrong decisions. With more certainty, with more precision about the results, we can see that there will be an improvement, hopefully, of implementation. The approach does not assume that implementation happens just because of a new information or a new study, because there are many ways to improve implementation. But what it does, it considers the improvement of implementation that can be attributed to the results of a larger study or a new information provided through that study. The health and economic benefits, if we can monetize health benefits and combine these with other economic benefits and compare the total monetary benefits with the required budget for that research, and then that will allow us to calculate return on research investment. To illustrate how uncertainty can be quantified and assessed, and as a driver to the value of information. So if we have the mean distribution of the mean difference in effect between two interventions, all in all, we can see that the new intervention appears to be more effective. But there is a margin of error that is in red. And it's not just the probability of making the error, it's the consequences of that error that matters. And as you can see, we have some negative numbers indicating maybe a negative result or some monetary losses from that uncertainty. As we collect more evidence, we will improve precision, and that probability margin will shrink. And this means that we will have a lower chance of error, and the consequences of making a wrong decision will be reduced. Now, the green shaded area, which is the reduction in uncertainty, is what we refer to as the value of new information. With this in mind, value of information analyses has been applied to inform a number of decisions. It is very valuable in informing decision-making because it tells us whether the existing evidence is sufficient to inform decision-making to implement a new intervention, or if additional research to reduce uncertainty is worthwhile before implementation. When we if we need more research, then the approach can help us design efficient trials by identifying the sample size that would maximize return on investment, because the more patients we recruit, the more resources we consume. Also, it's useful for research prioritization, because if we know the return on investment of alternative research proposals, we could prioritize these based on the return on investment. So this is where value information can inform decision-making, simultaneously considering the cost effectiveness of the intervention and the value for money of the new research. When there is low uncertainty and the intervention appears to be cost effective, then the decision would be to implement. If it is not cost effective and the evidence is sufficient to support that, then we might reject that intervention. And there are scenarios where we may say maybe. So an intervention seems to be promising, but the evidence is highly uncertain. And in this case, we may implement the intervention while collecting more evidence. Alternatively, if we think the intervention is not cost effective, but there is high uncertainty, we may delay implementation and wait for more information to be collected. Another example, if you want to optimize clinical trial design, as you can see here, the sample size of 200 participants in each arm. In this example, we have maximized return on investment. And although other sample sizes appear to be positive, this sample size would maximize our return on investment. And this can give us a good way to efficiently design our trials. And when it comes to research prioritization, these are the results from our study where we applied value of information to a range of clinical trials under the NHMRC National Center for Research Excellence in Nursing. And we've demonstrated how this approach can be used to inform, to prioritize actually the clinical trials and to give researchers an indication whether they should go ahead with a larger trial or not. There are many other examples from other countries. I've just listed some of these here from the UK, USA, and Australia. Most of these examples based on value of information being used alongside health technology assessment and using decision modeling. And this is why the application of this approach in informing research prioritization and its use by CTNs remains limited. I've listed here some of the barriers, and the main barriers that we've observed with our engagement with CTNs and other stakeholders is the lack of expertise and capacity to develop decision models and conduct economic evaluations, especially by funders who have large number of applications to consider in each round. Also, there are questions about what about other criteria for decision-making. Value for money should not be the only criteria considered. What about equity, feasibility, etc.? And how, if you want to adopt this approach, how should we integrate it into the existing research prioritization and funding processes? Well, luckily, over the past 5 years or so, we've witnessed new approaches and practical approaches to simplify the way we estimate value of research or value of information analysis. One of the leading articles was published by Clarkson and colleagues in New York. It was published in the BMJ 5 years ago about how value of information can be used and can be applied directly to the results of meta-analysis, for example, without the need for economic evaluation to estimate the health benefits from a new clinical trial. This was motivated by the work that the group did with PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute in the US. And as you know, in the US, economic evaluations are not as popular or used to inform decision-making as it is as they are in Australia. But what this work has allowed is allow the calculation of return on investment using small number of variables and without the need for full economic modeling. In this slide, we've listed some of the parameters that can be used to estimate the return on investment or value of research. And these can be extracted from clinical applications for grants for clinical trial proposals, for example. They include parameters to allow the calculation of value of reducing decision uncertainty, and also those that are useful to inform implementation in practice. Example of these, and the focus, as you can see here, is the primary outcome, because most of the time we design our clinical trials around that outcome. So if we know what primary outcome we want to investigate, what we know already about this outcome from maybe a pilot study or a group, a pool of pilot studies, what confidence intervals we have around that measure. And likewise, if we have a competitor, and if we know anything about the cost, that would be also informative if we want to take an economic approach to that. Also, when it comes to implementation, having an idea about the current level of implementation and what we expect to see based on the results of a new clinical trial or study, then that will allow us to estimate the return on investment of that new research. So with the first one, okay, we cannot do the evaluation. We cannot do this model that you called simple. So what should we do if we want to assess value for money for research? Now, luckily, we have witnessed the development of a number of web-based tools to assess value for money of clinical trials. And I'll try to demonstrate one of them, which is RAIN, that's the Rapid Assessment of Need for Evidence. I'll try and share my screen. So I hope everyone can see this tool now. So this one was developed for PCORI in the US. And if we want to assess the value for money of the phosphate trial, as you can see, you have 3 steps to follow. So this is a binary outcome. We want to measure this in natural units. It's harm avoided, because we want to avoid cardiovascular disease, and we want to name the outcome as CVD. The next step is to look at the uncertainty in based on our existing knowledge, and it's a 20% reduction, that is 80%. And if we want to look at the baseline, which was 8% from what we know already about the risk of cardiovascular disease in this population. So we could specify maybe more accurately the uncertainty based on the confidence intervals that we have from existing evidence. And then you would provide some information about the study. It's a full randomized controlled trial expected to finish in 5 years. And this is the cost. And the population was around 3,000. And we want to measure this in Australian dollars. And we would run the analysis. And we will get the results. The results are, we could get the overall results, a summary of the results, broken down here into the value of improving implementation or changing practice, as well as the value of reducing uncertainty. And in this example, just based on the data that I've just entered into the tool live, you will see that it is expected that improving implementation will avoid 83 cardiovascular disease events. And also in terms of reducing uncertainty, it's estimated to be around 3 CVDs avoided. Now, these are rough estimates because the way I configured the settings, it was live and quick. But if you want to adjust these and give it a go, you would get maybe slightly different results. But this tool in seconds calculated what we expect to get out of this clinical trial expressed in health outcomes. The only downside of this is because it's designed for the US and also for jurisdictions that may not be interested in value of the cost effectiveness of the intervention, it doesn't look at the cost effectiveness by considering the cost of phosphate binders in this case. But it's a good way to quickly estimate the return on investment based on the uncertainty from the pilot study that we used. We'll go back to my presentation. So this is one of the examples, but and it can be used. The problem is it is not does not consider the cost effectiveness of the intervention, as I have just mentioned. What about other considerations? If you are interested in equity, and also if you want to consider other elements such as the criteria that we've developed here at the ACTA Research Prioritization group, such as relevance, scientific rigor, feasibility. So how can this approach be incorporated and used alongside other criteria? Well, there are different ways to do this. One way is to apply these criteria or single criterion as an additional lens to our decision making. So, for example, in this equity plane, you can see that we would prioritize research studies that highly address equity, but at the same time, they are value for money. And definitely, we will not fund interventions that are not looking at how they are considered. We're not funding clinical trials where equity is not sufficiently considered. Another way to do this is what we discussed last workshop, where multiple criteria decision making can be applied, and the results from value information analysis can inform some of the criteria, particularly the criterion around research significance, and the total score can be calculated. And this is one way to incorporate this return on investment with other criteria. Another approach that we proposed in this framework, and this is of particular maybe use for research funders. One way is to continue doing the merits assessment based on the criteria of proposals as a first two steps of any process of research prioritization or assessment for funding. And once we have a short list of, let's say, top 10% or 3% or 5% of proposals, we can apply quantitative methods like return on investment to these.
Excuse me, Hanson. Could you pop into presenter view? You're in a notes view.
Oh, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. In conclusion, value for money of clinical trials should be considered when making research prioritization and funding decisions. It is important to have explicit comparison of research costs and benefits to ensure that we maximize return on research investment. I would emphasize and say that a practical programmable tool that is designed to meet the needs of Australian stakeholders is needed to facilitate value of clinical trials calculation. And we are really keen to collaborate and work with funding organizations like NHMRC and MRFF and other peak bodies in developing and testing such a tool for to be used in Australia. I'd like to stop here. I think this is all I have for today. I'd like to hand over to Wolfgang.
Thank you for that, Hanson. And I totally agree with a tool that makes life easier for a lot of people would be very valuable to possess value of information. Our next talker is Carmel Hawley. Carmel is a Senior Staff Specialist and Director of Hemodialysis. My screen is just gone. Bear with me a moment. Here we go. So Carmel Hawley is a Senior Staff Specialist and Director of Hemodialysis Service at Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane. In addition, she is an Associate Professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Queensland and Chair of the Australian Kidney Trials Network, formed in 2005. The focus of her talk today will be on the Australian Kidney Trials Network and their experience of research prioritisation. So welcome, Carmel, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm just making sure I've got it on the right format here.
And you do, thank you.
Is that okay?
It is, thanks.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for the invitation. Prioritisation's been a major focus of our network, which has now been going for about 15 years. And what I'm going to cover today in the 10 minutes is to talk about what we currently do, what our approach is, talk about what we might see as the advantages of the frameworks that Hatham's been through in the last half hour or so, talk about what we see as potential barriers for networks to adopt these processes. And then I would just want to touch on the actual measurement of outcomes and impact in such settings. I'm just going to put this whole framework up and then go through this. So just to let you know what we do as a network, we actually take processes right from when the research question starts, so when people propose questions, they come into the network and there's a process we follow, which goes through an iteration of discussion, and that's what I'm going to focus on soon. If a project is deemed worthy of pushing further and approaching funding bodies, we then take this proposal to the funding bodies and then process the whole trial, and we look after every aspect of the trial, including safety, efficacy, cost analyses. And importantly, most of us, or the majority of us, are trying to get into implementation and measurement of impact, which I think is something we can discuss today, which is probably in its infancy in some degree and poses quite significant challenges, just as in the prioritisation poses major challenges. So just to go over, we have various groups who propose ideas to our group. And I just want to explain where these come from. So the particular ideas for trials and the hypotheses, outcomes, etc., that are put forward generally come from the Kidney Trials Network special interest groups. I'll talk to that again in a minute. There are also proposals that come from guideline groups. So we have a Caring for Australians, Australasians with renal impairment group, which actually go through guidelines, update guidelines. This is part of the Cochrane group. And as part of that process, where the evidence gaps are found is presented to our group. So that's an important connection. We also are approached by international collaborators who want to make an important idea feasible, and of course, the external validation across many different populations. So that's also a really important part of how we assess different ideas. Just the special interest groups, the idea of that is that we have specialists in kidney transplantation, in dialysis, such as what I mainly do, in chronic kidney disease before end-stage disease, and other groups such as acute kidney injury, And we have what we call a methods group, and every trial has to go to the methods group for an assessment of, for example, the data architecture, the statistical approaches, the trial methodology, whether it should be adaptive, non-adaptive, embedded, non-embedded. So we do have those structures in place but we've actually over time really increased the methodological approaches and rigor and processes we follow. We also do get unsolicited requests for peer review and support. And also we do get individuals coming forward with ideas. To date, we haven't had any specifically from the consumer groups, but I'm sure that will happen over time, which would be good. We then go through a process of assessment, and I'll go through that. So what's the protocol journey for us? I'll just put this all up and then I can go through it. It's probably best. So I did explain to you that a research proposal comes to the executive operations from a number of groups, but more specifically, most often through a working group with specialists in that area. And our working groups comprise of people at all stages of training and expertise, but we do have real experts in this group, and we have representation from our trials executive in these working groups to ensure the processes are followed. The working group then collaborates with the proposer. This is particularly important if someone has, for example, a transplant trial, isn't part of the working group, but wants a trial progressed through and carried out by the Kidney Trials Network. So what happens there is that the researchers within the working group review the proposal. Two people formally go through the proposal, and then there's a meeting where the proposal is discussed. And then a formal response occurs. Then a recommendation is made. Most ideas that progress through the working group do come to fruition to the point where we approach funders. And that's because these groups really do know the priority areas and come up with ideas that should be progressed. We don't support all trials, but most trials at least get a good hearing. The failure to be supported generally relates to feasibility, or the fact that it's not a priority, or there's no trial structure that would really be able to carry out this trial, or there are other competing trials in the area which such that, again, that goes back to feasibility and be able to carry it out. To date, we haven't had to stop trials on the basis of capacity, but that's potentially something that will happen. We then collaborate, approach funding bodies, and if successful, then we carry out the trial. What are the issues with our current approach? Well, currently, although we consider relevance, significance, feasibility, we don't actually come up with a formal quantitative score, although all these aspects are looked at. We do look at value for money and what the impact would be on patients and the economy. But again, we don't have a quantitative score. We don't go through the formal processes that Hattie's outlined. The trial design aspects isn't as much of a worry for us, because if we believe in the trial's intention, then we will wrap the design and appropriateness around the trial. So we deal with that. But the other aspects do have to be there. What are the issues with our current approach? I think there's potentially opportunity costs that we don't give the right attention to what are the most important things we should be doing. And I think, like many others, since the institution of MRFF, we do have a lot of time pressures when targeted funding calls come in, which are time critical. And really, sometimes we feel rushed by the need to approach such funding call timeline. Before this, there was pretty much an annual clock you could set by, which gave you adequate time to get there. So I think MRFF's created that challenge. So what would be the advantages of prioritization? Well, I think that a systematic approach would be very useful from many points of view. There would be more transparency for people proposing or groups proposing projects. There would be a practical use of limited resources. This is value for money, but also appropriate opportunity costs would be recognised. It would allow selection of projects that have maximum return on investment, which hasn't been as much of a focus for us. What are the barriers? Well, I think the process would be similar, although we would use the frameworks that have been outlined today. There would be more quantification. Would there be more disagreements and disappointments? It's hard to know. There might be less. So I think we would have to look at the impact of doing that. I think one of the drawbacks is that the difficult timelines of trials in the competitive research funding calendar, with the funding opportunities coming up that are in line with what you want to do. And perhaps the framework would be difficult to engage absolutely to a team in the timeline required. So I think that's something we have to look at. Anyway, to summarise going forward, our current determination of projects to take forward does have limitations. The targeted funding calls do put pressure on the timeline to get projects to a satisfactory position and discussion. Providing tools to the network would enable more effective prioritisation. It's something that we are going to embrace, but I think we do need to measure the impact of the tools and where they particularly help. So we will consider this. I do want to point out, I think we had a lot of discussion about projecting costs and benefits, but I think absolutely measuring value for money at the end of the trials is difficult, and you do require actual measurements, which can be often very difficult. So I'd like to stop there and hand back to the chair. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Carmel. Very interesting. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please pop your questions in the chat. Our next speaker is Greg Mullins, and a pleasure introducing Greg. I've known Greg for some time now through Research Australia, and Greg has been the head of policy at Research Australia since 2012, having previously worked across the community, public and private sectors. Greg's role includes developing Research Australia's input into government policy in areas as diverse as the Medical Research Future Fund, tax incentives for startups, and the availability of government databases for research purposes. He also helps implement Research Australia's own research objectives on behalf of its membership, who are drawn from across the whole of the health and medical research pipeline. Today, Greg's going to talk about the importance of research prioritisation. So welcome, Greg, and over to you.
Thanks for the invitation and for that introduction, Paul. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, as Paul said, Research Australia is the national peak body for Australian health and medical research. We represent the entire pipeline from the laboratory through to patient and the marketplace. And Research Australia, I guess, really works to position Australian HMR as a significant driver of a healthy population and a healthy economy. We think both of those are really important. I've been asked to talk about the importance of research prioritisation. For those of you who are here on Tuesday, this might seem like this presentation should have been then, but please bear with me and hopefully I can join the dots. Sorry. So Research Australia's vision is about research delivering better healthcare. And we know this is what the community cares about, and that's why they support funding for health and medical research. And they do support it. More funding for health and medical research is consistently in the top 10 spending priorities for Australian government in our annual opinion polling of the public. And it's actually number 3 this year, behind more funding for the health system and education, and ahead of the environment, infrastructure and aged care. And the combined annual funding from the MRFF and NHMRC is now around $1.5 billion per year, which is a significant commitment by our community. It's a lot of money, but we know it's not enough to fund everything. It's an essential that we spend this money wisely. It's also important that we choose efficiently, that we get the best projects funded with the minimum required effort to select them. And this relies on funding programs that clearly specify their selection criteria and on having the right people make the right decisions and giving them the right tools. Getting this right helps ensure we continue to have the support of public and government, so we're able to deliver the outcomes that they're expecting. The process of selecting research funding applications is necessarily time-consuming and expensive. So what we have here are the statistics from just one of the NHMRC's smaller funding programs, and probably the most relevant to today's discussion. And so you can see that to allocate $74 million to 30 projects required assessment of 436 applications. So obviously this requires enormous resources and thousands of hours of assessment by peer reviewers. But of course, I don't need to tell this audience that because it's you, our research community, that volunteers to undertake this task. We know the peer review process is under pressure. Application numbers are increasing, and there's a greater emphasis is being put on assessing impact. This is about getting the selection criteria right and selecting for impact. This is great. It's really important, I think, as we all know, but it's taken many peer reviewers outside their comfort zone, and we know it's caused consternation in the last few years. The NHMRC has made changes to the peer review process, but the pressure remains, and there's scope to do more to improve the process and take some of the pressure off reviewers. So let's talk about the Voi framework. I finally got here, and I think this is where it really could make a big difference. I'd like to congratulate ACTA and Hanson in particular on the report they produced on Voi. I'm by no means an expert in this area, but I think it provides some real opportunities. And I know the focus has been on how the Voi framework can support clinical trials networks' own prioritization processes, but I think it could have broader applications, as Hanson alluded to earlier. I think it has the capacity to lead to better decisions by leading to better assessments of the potential impact of different proposals, and not just for prioritization by clinical trial networks, but as a tool that can be used by funding bodies. I think it also has the scope to support more transparency in decision-making, and I think Carmel alluded to this earlier. Voi provides a more objective assessment of quite different applications against the same criteria. Finally, there's also the opportunity to make the work of decision makers more effective and efficient by providing them with a clear and consistent basis for decision-making on impact. But can it deliver? I think we all know that implementation is the real acid test. The Voi framework isn't without costs in time and money. I note it took 6 weeks to extract the data, analyse it, and prepare the report on the proposals for the RCT for the telehealth intervention that's included in the report. So the question is, can we make this process faster and cheaper? And I understand the analysis of the proposals took 1 week of the 6. And I note there are web tools being developed, and hopefully this can help reduce the time and cost. If the necessary data is captured as part of the application process, the assessment of Voi might be able to be undertaken in parallel with other parts of the application assessment process without adding to the time required. Even if this can be done, though, there's still questions about how it could be used. So, for example, does it replace decision makers' assessment of impact, or it is a tool for them to use to inform their assessment? If the latter, will the framework and the scores it produced be accepted by application assessors? If the score and the methodology becomes a point of contention between assessors, then it could make the process more difficult. And the same goes for applicants. While transparency is important, it potentially gives applicants more information about assessments, which can be used to challenge decisions. I think these are real risks. And so how a framework's utilised and integrated into any existing application assessment process is going to be really critical. I suspect its introduction is going to require its own trial project with a rigorous assessment of whether and how it adds value. Just in conclusion, I think this is a great idea. It's addressing a real problem, which is that impact is critical. It's the whole reason for doing something, but it's very difficult to assess in advance. And this is a problem not just for CTNs, but for funding bodies. As I said before, I think implementation is going to be critical. To be successful, the Voi framework has to fit into existing assessment processes. It not only has to make the decision-making better, but it's going to need to make the process faster and more efficient if it's going to be accepted. All of this is possible, though, and I'm really keen to hear about the next steps because I think the journey is really only just starting today. So thanks for listening to me, and I look forward to hearing from you all in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Craig, for that. Nice presentation. We've got 30 minutes or so for a panel discussion at the end with Q&A. And so welcome you all to put questions in the chat, and we'll go from there. But before we do it, I'd like to introduce Professor Paul Hanson. I was fortunate enough to have him as my PhD supervisor many years ago now, so it's great to see him again. And Paul is a professor of economics at the University of Otago in freezing cold Dunedin, New Zealand, and co-inventor of 1000 Minds decision-making and conjoint analysis software. His research interests include prioritization and resource allocation, especially in the health sector. Paul has been an advisor to the WHO, a contractor for Google, and consulted or worked with New Zealand's Treasury, Ministry of Health, and Pharmac. He loves working with his colleagues around the world to help with their decision-making using 1000 Minds, and loves surfing and beer, of course, as we all do, especially the beer. So Paul will join the panel discussion today for the Q&A sessions. So we welcome your questions and participation in this, and love to hear from you. Please post your questions in the chat and we'll go from there. There are a couple I see to start with, which is great for icebreakers, I suppose. But Hanson, there was a question for you posed early on. Do you have references for the primary and economic analyses papers that you could share or recommend people look at around VOI? That might be something to follow up with people later. I'll ask the presenters if they can turn on their videos and so forth. I can see Paul there.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Can
you hear me now?
Yes, thanks, Haytham.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, definitely, thank you for the question. I'm happy to, I provided some of those references in the presentation, but I'm happy to provide a list of key or essential articles about the topic, I think for people who want to develop some knowledge about the approach, if that's your question. If your question about the case study that I presented, this is part of a report that we prepared recently for ACTA, and it should be released very soon, and it should be available for the public.
Thanks, Haytham. I will follow on from that with another question from Greg, asking, has anyone used VOI in an automated application assessment process?
That's an excellent question. To my knowledge, no. And most of the applications of VOI, and this is why it was developed, were mainly around health technology assessment to inform the need for additional research before reimbursing a new technology. What we want to do now, as Greg correctly commented on the VOI approach, is to put it to the test, where we have large number of applications and we need to provide mechanisms, frameworks, an approach of how we could maybe automatically extract the data and apply a tool to estimate return on investment. In the framework we proposed is when those key parameters can be provided by applicants, for example, and they would fit directly into a tool to calculate based on those. They would be verified first by the panel of experts, and then they can be fed directly into the tool to be calculated. Whether or not we should apply this body of information to all applications or a short list of applications that passed the first hurdle of quality, maybe feasibility, scientific rigor, and then that shortlisted or shortlist maybe is the one that we should apply body of information to. That's one approach to make it more efficient. But back to your question, I'm not aware of any automated use of massive number of applications using VOI.
Well, I've got you there, Haytham. I'm going to follow up on that with a question from myself, and that is, what would it take to develop a tool that would be, web-based for people to access and put their data in and push the button and include that in grant applications or in an assessment process when they're reviewing applications? But how much time would be involved, what resources would be involved?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So it depends on the scope and of the tool and the complexity of the analysis we want to include, etc. So, for example, if you want to develop a generic tool like the one I presented from York, it's very generic and can be applied to different diseases and conditions. And this one would take between maybe around 1 year to develop, and then maybe another year to test to see, like we could test it to a number of applications and see how it works, then modify it. So we're talking about 2 years of work to get this developed and tested. This amount of time could be reduced if you want to focus on a particular disease. There are tools for cardiovascular disease, for example, or oncology. That could be also an option. The other thing I would say, most of the available tools did not include, they were not co-designed in a perfect way where we have consumers, funders, researchers included. So if we want to have a deep, thorough process of involvement and engagement with stakeholders, that would also take time, but that would assure that we would have a fit for purpose tool to be used in Australia.
And Greg has just made a comment that you need to capture a lot of information in an application that isn't used for any other purposes in an application. So I would see the grant application with a separate appendix or something, or a one page with the information you'd need for the VOI. Is that how you would see it rolling out? Or?
Yes, I'm just trying to understand the question a better way. Would you need to capture a lot of information in the application that is not used? Yeah, so
Greg has put his hand up. Maybe he wants to.
Maybe you want to
talk to that himself.
Yeah, perhaps I'd better explain my question. I guess, Haytham, just thinking about, application processes, there's already a lot of information that's collected. I do think, this could work if it would make the process more accurate, but it's also going to need to make it more efficient, I think, if it's going to work. So the question is, I guess, how much of the VOI could be done using information that's already captured as part of a funding application, and how much of it would require information that would be unique to the VOI process that wouldn't be there for other purposes?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think if we want to apply this approach in the future, we need to ask for applicants to provide the information that we need to calculate VOI. And those information should not be a burden for additional information. Because, for example, the main estimate we want is what we know already about the relative effectiveness of the intervention. This should be provided in any application. If you want to calculate the sample size of developing a hypothesis, it's not acceptable, for example, to put an application without conducting a systematic review or referring to a systematic review of the literature. So I would say I wouldn't say like we need to keep it loose and where people can put in the application whatever they want. Of course, they can, but it would be good if there are a minimum set of maybe parameters that are required, because these are essential to inform decision making, whether or not a VOI is implemented. Mentioning something about the significance of that clinical trial improving implementation. What do you think will happen? What's the current status of what's the current practice? The epidemiology of the disease or the burden, the population. So all of these were captured actually in. We found these available in the case study that we reviewed, but I do agree with you. Sometimes you don't find these, and this is time consuming. So ideally, I think that the items that are required to calculate VOI, they should be available in an application, regardless if VOI is going to be applied or not, because they are essential for decision making.
Yeah.
Can I ask
Sandra's,
Paul? Would that be okay?
Yeah, fire away, Paul.
Just to join the panel discussion. So it's for Haytham as well. So I really love the concept because I think I can see, it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of equivalent to doing sort of an economic evaluation on an economic evaluation, like, is it, trying to work out, it's the same, obviously, in this application of research. But my issue or question was, I still don't see, I can't see inside the black box. And you in your presentation, you told us and showed us all the data that's required, and Greg just followed up about whether this is captured in normal applications that people put forward. But it's not very transparent, or did I miss something? Or is there any way that it could be made transparent? And it may just reflect my newness to this way of thinking. But for example, a cost per quality gained, for example, or cost utility analysis, things that I guess health economists are familiar with. And again, this just may reflect my own expertise, but I kind of see where that comes from, and I'm sure I can very easily get inside it and turn the handle myself and check that the decimal point isn't the wrong place, and I can sort of sniff it and go, something missing there or something. And I know you were rushed for time, so you're pushing through it. But if there were more time, and you showed me the details, would I get it? Would I go, yeah, I can understand that, or would I still be sort of going, okay, the algorithm does it and all, but I don't know how it works?
Yeah, no, you can, and if you see, I can put that online tool again, for example, and for the list of parameters that you need to enter in that tool, it's very transparent, and anyone, if you share the interface with anyone, then people can change any of those parameters, and you can see how would that affect the results.
No, now, I can see the data going in, but how is it combined? That's what I'm missing.
Yeah. So in that, for example, in the example I presented, which was online, that was informed by the paper in the BMJ by Clarkson and colleagues, and that paper is accompanied by the way they look at they simulate the distributions of relative effectiveness when it is reported. So if you use the same sampling approach, which is straightforward, you don't have to do complex modeling or anything. It's just the same sampling. You would identify the margin of error. This margin of error is your probability of making an error. And then there is the loss function, which is the opportunity loss from that distribution. And it shows you clearly from the area under the curve what's being lost here, and you could assign monetary value to that. Now, what monetary value is acceptable or not acceptable, that could be also transparent. So if you say for each quality adjusted life year, we will accept a willingness to pay threshold of 50,000, etc. So that's one option. Another example is there is a tool for cardiovascular disease called Vector. I did not present all of these tools for the sake of time. But for example, this is disease specific. This is an example of a disease specific. The model is published, is validated, and it's available. Everyone can have a look at the model and all the parameters included. And you can trace what happened with your inputs and how your inputs were fed into the model to produce those results. So it depends on, for experts, for technical people, maybe like yourself, they want to see the actual calculation. And for end users, if they trust us, they would say, okay, that's fine. We want the interface to be more user-friendly, because all what we want to see is, okay, this is what we put, this is the output, and we trust that the results are rigor and valid.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I totally agree. I think that even there's a few papers on this topic, and a bit of general reading, you can soon pick up what the impetus for this is. What is it worth collecting an extra bit of information, or is it worth collecting any of this information? Is the payoff going to be worthwhile? What is the time horizon to get that payoff? Some of those questions come into it, and some things you'll just pull the plug on because you'll see that there's not a big enough population, or that the benefits are too small. But you've got to think of this, what we're doing. Is it for Australia, or is it for a small country like New Zealand, or is it for the world? And if we're inventing a drug and first to trial a new drug that has lots of other spin-off benefits, that's part of what goes into this, opposed to trialing a drug that's been widely used already. or an intervention or a health service. They're all competing for the same money. So, and that takes me to a question asked earlier about Carmel. She was asked, how do you determine that there are competing trials? I don't know if Carmel, you want to pop on and address that.
Yep. Okay. Well, we usually know what's going on in the Australian and New Zealand environment with trials, and for example, what industry trials are competing in that space and what investigator-initiated trials we're doing. We've got a broad enough constituents associated with these working groups and with other executive groups that we actually do know that, and particularly competing against our other trials that are going. We actually are very aware of that. So, but it may not always be easy to determine.
Too true. Thank you, Carmel. Couple of other questions around back to VOI. So do you need to standardise horizons and willingness to pay thresholds before we can really move forward with VOI?
Yeah, that's
willingness to pay, but not horizons. But over to you, Hazen.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because one of the issues around value of information that was introduced is it calculates net monetary benefits, and to do so, you need to have a willingness to pay for those outcomes. In the example I showed from the RAIN tool and the paper by Claxton and colleagues in the BMJ. So what they did, and that's primarily was because it was for the US setting. So all these benefits were reported in, for example, cardiovascular disease avoided, number of cases avoided, or maybe survival, and then that's compared to the budget. So ideally, you need to have a willingness to pay threshold. It's very similar to what we do when we have economic evaluation, because the same question applies, even if you want to do just an economic evaluation. If you don't, or you don't use economic evaluations to inform decision making, then you can do this assessment based on the health benefits by using the primary outcome, could be survival or hospitalization avoided or cardiovascular events avoided. And with this uncertainty, you could look at the number of certain events avoided, or maybe if it's a benefit achieved per the budget requested. Now, yes, definitely we need the sort of to say, okay, is this sufficient or not? But sometimes it's really clear that if that benefit is really much smaller to compared to the budget that we are asking, or if the budget was the other way around, that benefits, maybe number of cases avoided is really big enough to justify. So that will give us sort of an indication. But this is the same problem that we have with economic evaluation, let alone VOI, is do we need a specific willingness to pay threshold or not? For some countries, they don't have. And as you know, recently we have efforts to empirically derive these, as what happened in the UK, what happened here in Adelaide. We have now an empirical estimate of willingness to pay for Australia, which can be used.
A more general question is around the use of VOI, value of information, in rare diseases, and so it's tapping into into an equity type matter here. So rare diseases, very few patients, the benefits might be relatively small. Are they at risk of being overlooked completely if we look at return on investment and value of information and so forth? And we know the Australian government has special schemes for some of these rare diseases where they fund things way beyond a willingness to pay threshold. An example is haemophilia A, where a new drug costs $600,000 a year that the government funds. There's some genetic diseases, spinomuscular atrophy. There's a genetic medicine for that, one-off treatment for $3.5 million as a neonate. Big money. It's a huge amount of uncertainty for the future for some of these things. It's be interesting to see or to hear how we deal with these. And I'm going to throw to Paul after you answer, Hazen, about what are the alternatives to VOI. So,
yeah, look, that's another excellent question. And this issue with rare diseases, because value of information is a function of the probability of making a wrong decision, the consequence of that, and the population. So definitely, if you have a small population, then compared to a larger population, so I totally understand your point that may favor a disease, study in a disease with more population. However, unlike other approaches, because value of information considers also uncertainty. So you can imagine that the uncertainty is high already in this population. So it's not just the burden of the disease that's based on the samples, the population size, but it's also the uncertainty. So because uncertainty is higher, it's under-researched area. So that might offset some of the disadvantage from having a smaller population. But still, the other consideration, as Paul said, remember these approaches that we presented, and any economic evaluation is meant to inform rather than prescribe what should be done. And it should be considered alongside other considerations, particularly equity. There are approaches to adjust any of economic evaluation findings, or I don't see a reason why VOI results can be adjusted as well, where you could multiply these by a certain weight or something to adjust for, to achieve that equity, or achieve to consider that this condition is rare. So that's one consideration. But the key message is this approach is not meant to prescribe. It's not meant to be the only factor that should determine whether a trial is funded or not.
Thank you, Hanson. So that leads nicely into what I was going to ask Paul. Do you see 1,000 Minds and MCDA being a complement or substitute to return on investment, value of information type analyses, or can you see both being used simultaneously? Or
yeah, I think I can, but first a disclaimer: those of you who are here, and must be Tuesday, it's Thursday today, isn't it? In the first workshop, I presented on MCDM and 1,000 Minds software, and so always be suspicious. For a man who has a big hammer, most problems start looking like nails. So I am very MCDM focused, but I would say MCDM as a discipline, multi-criteria decision making as a discipline, as it's moved into the health sector largely because of dissatisfaction with over-reliance, as people saw it, on cost utility analysis, basically cost effectiveness analysis, working out cost per quality, because people quite rightly said, patients and policymakers and clinicians said to boring old health economists, surely there's more than cost per quality of adjusted life year. There's things like, equity and thinking about patients with the greatest need, and all sorts of distributional concerns, and I guess things like clinical evidence. And so multi-criteria decision-making was seen as a framework to try and, in an overarching fashion, bring all of those things together, because it is a multi-criteria decision. So I wonder, and again, I'm relatively new to VOI, and that's why I've really enjoyed today's session. It seems to me that VOI potentially would fit nicely in, and probably with some overlap. So you'd have to be careful not to double count things, but some overlap with, some of the benefits that would, I guess, now it's conventionally be measured or incorporated into multi-criteria decision making. And so I think the two things do fit together. Again, bearing in my disclaimer at the start of this little speech, it sounds like I'm sort of saying that I guess VOI would sort of subsume itself into multi-criteria decision making. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but again, where I come from, multi-criteria decision making is capable of admitting any criteria that clinicians or whoever the decision makers deem to be important in making the decision. And the decision's relatively simple at a philosophical level. Is this research worth doing? Is this treatment worth doing? And of course, that's really just trying to recognize, as has so often been said in today's session, opportunity costs. If we spend the resources in this way, that means we can't spend them in another way. So we're trying to, of course, find a framework by which we can bring all those, into the mix, all those things that we think of as benefits and costs in a way that's generic enough to look across different either research projects or topics or applications for funding for research, depending at what level we're at. And again, thinking back to the presentation on Monday, I think it's from Rachel. You know, there's those different layers, but again, fundamental, it's like we've got a limited resource. We want to make the best use of it. So again, all these things I think should be able to be brought together in order to address that question, so that we're getting the greatest bang for buck, or the best value for money, or we're generating the best patient outcomes and the best distributional concerns. I mean, so again, to me, MCDM is capable of a lot of things that are appearing in the Voi framework, and again, a lot of it's new to me, but also the equity concerns, clearly the health economics concerns, such as quality adjusted life years and cost, etc. And of course, you know, what's the purpose? We're trying to help policymakers or decision makers or funders, again, achieve that very important goal of squeezing the most out of the scarce resource. So, I mean, it's got to be a worthwhile activity to try and find these connections and overlaps and bring it together into a really powerful framework. But it needs to be generic enough, doesn't it? Because we've got to be able to compare apples with oranges across different uses of those resources. What do you reckon, Paul?
Fantastic. Comparing apples and oranges. Love it. We do have preferences for one or the other, and sometimes both. And Greg's got his hand up to follow on from there. Greg.
Well, yeah, just following on that question of the relative value of research and what research for rare diseases is competing with. I mean, I think as a community, we make that decision that we will invest in rare disease research, and we create targeted calls of funding for those. And so the role of VOI in that context is not really comparing research for a rare disease against research for kidney disease or something more broadly. It's actually allowing you to make comparisons around proposals that are put forward for that pool of funding for rare disease research. So it is more like comparing apples with apples rather than apples with oranges, I think. And
but even Greg, surely within rare diseases, there's a lot of there would be maybe different types of apples. Then some red, some green, some sour, some sweet.
Yeah, but you're not talking about comparing research for a rare disease and the outcomes for a small number of patients with research that's potentially going to benefit millions. So yeah, I think it still has.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Of course.
Yeah.
Someone just popped in the chat. There's 70,000. I guess that's 70,000 rare diseases, and probably
70,000 apples. Oh, sorry, 7,000. There we go.
70. Yeah, but it's
still a lot. It's a hell of a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, and sorry, Paul, I've provided a link to for more resources if anyone is interested in Convoy. Convoy is the collaboration consortium for value of information. So that's a collaboration of international experts, and value of information has resources, tools, methods. So for anyone, it's one-stop shop for anyone who wants to learn more about that approach.
Thank you, Hanson. And we're almost at time, so I'm going to start to draw things to a close. I wonder if there's any burning, summing up thoughts from the panel members.
Thanks for the opportunity.
So. Can I just say, as a New Zealander from across the ditch, I'm just so impressed by the interest that's shown here in the leadership too from ACTA, but all the other groups that are present here today and on Tuesday. I do not see this happening in New Zealand, which I find a little bit embarrassing. So I think we'll be watching. Well, hopefully people like my colleagues will be looking across and trying to learn from what you're doing. So feel free to share it. There's a great need for it, of course, in our tiny wee country.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to wrap up now. So ACTA's purchased, just following on from 1,000 Minds, ACTA's purchased a license for 1,000 Minds software that will be set up with the research prioritization templates for ACTA members to use, and you'll be contacted once it is ready for use. ACTA will circulate the return on investment documents when these are ready as well, so the report that was done, the reports, and we'd also like to invite you all to ACTA's annual scientific meeting, which will be held on the 10th to the 12th of November. I think that's likely to be a virtual meeting, but it might be face-to-face. So don't have the details, sorry. But, they'll be on the ACTA site. And thank you to all the presenters and panelists today. So Hanson, Carmel, Greg, and Paul, thank you for attending, and we hope you enjoyed. Hope everybody's enjoyed the workshop today, and look forward to seeing you at the annual scientific meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul Scuffin, for chairing.
Thank you for chairing it.